It was 4017 in the morning when I sent the message, and I remembered the exact time because I'd been staring at the monitor next to my hospital bed, watching the numbers climb and fall, too afraid to look away in case they stopped. My fingers were shaking when I typed it. We got the diagnosis. It's stage 3. I start chemo Monday. I could really use my family right now. I hit send to the group chat the 4 of us had shared since I was a teenager, and then I just held the phone against my chest in the dark, waiting for it to light up. The first reply came 11 minutes later. It was from my stepmother. It said, "Try not to make a scene about this at the reception. Okay. Wedding's in 3 weeks. I read it 4 times. I thought I'd misunderstood. I thought maybe my brain, swollen with fear and sleeplessness, had scrambled the words. But no, that was the message. That was the first thing anyone said to me after I told them my body was trying to kill me. Don't make a scene. Don't ruin the wedding. My name is Tessa. I'm 29 years old. And at the time all of this happened, I was working as a dental hygienist in a mid-sized clinic outside Columbus, the kind of place with fish tanks in the waiting room and a coffee machine that never quite worked. I had a small apartment, a cat named Biscuit, and a savings account that I'd built up dollar by dollar because I'd learned young that nobody was coming to catch me if I fell. I want you to understand that I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't the kind of person who fished for attention. If anything, I was the opposite. I apologized when people bumped into me. So when I finally worked up the nerve to tell my family I had ovarian cancer, it was not a small thing. It was me breaking every rule I'd ever made for myself about not being a burden. Let me back up, because the wedding matters. My younger half-sister was getting married that fall. I'll call her my sister because for most of my life, that's what I tried to make her be, even when she didn't make it easy. She was marrying into money, real money, the kind with a last name attached to a hospital wing and a building at the university. Her fiancé's family had a compound on a lake and a grandmother who wore actual pearls to brunch. And my stepmother, who had spent 20 years feeling like she'd married slightly below the life she deserved, treated that wedding like it was her own coronation. She had spreadsheets. She had a color palette. She had, I am not exaggerating, a binder. So when my diagnosis landed in the middle of all that, I didn't even land as a person. I landed as a scheduling problem. My father didn't text at all that first night. The next morning, around 9, he sent a thumbs up. Just that. The little blue thumbs up, reacting to my message about chemotherapy like I told him I'd picked up milk on the way home. I stared at that thumbs up for so long the screen went dark, and I had to tap it to bring it back, just to confirm it was real. I think that hurt more than the silence would have. Silence you can explain away. He's processing. He's scared. He doesn't have the words. But a thumbs up is a choice. A thumbs up is someone reading the worst news of your life and deciding it warranted the absolute minimum amount of effort a human being can produce. The chemo started Monday, like the doctor said. If you've never done it, I won't pretend I can make you feel it. The first round wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the cold cap they put on my scalp to try to save my hair, this frozen helmet that made my skull ache so badly I bit through my own lip. The worst part was driving myself home afterward because there was nobody to drive me, gripping the wheel at 2 miles under the speed limit, pulling over twice to be sick into a grocery bag in the passenger seat. The worst part was getting into my own bed alone and realizing the ceiling was the only thing that was going to keep me company through this. I had friends. I want to be clear about that, because the story I'm telling could make it sound like I was completely alone, and I wasn't. And the people who showed up deserve to be named, even if my family doesn't. My coworker, a woman about 15 years older than me who'd survived breast cancer in her 40s, started showing up at my apartment with soup she'd made herself. My downstairs neighbor, a retired school teacher, took biscuit for me on the days I couldn't lift the litter box. These were people who owed me nothing. They were the ones who held the bucket while my own father sent emojis. I kept texting the group chat, though. I don't know why. Hope, maybe, or just habit. I'd send updates like I was reporting to a command center that had long since abandoned its post. Round 2 done. Counts are low, so they're watching for infection. Lost most of my hair this week. The cold cap didn't really work. I'd send these into the void and watch the little read receipts appear, gray and indifferent, and then nothing. My sister never responded to a single one. Not one. 3 months of treatment, and she couldn't type the word okay. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that there was a second conversation happening. A group chat I wasn't in. Here's what I pieced together afterward. My stepmother, the architect of the perfect wedding, had been managing the narrative the whole time. To the extended family, to my aunts, to the cousins, even to my sister's new in-laws, she had recast the entire situation. I wasn't sick. I was struggling. I was, in her words, going through something and looking for attention, and wasn't it just like me to do it right when there was something big happening for somebody else? She told people I'd always been jealous of my sister. She told my grandmother, who was in her 80s and trusting and lived 4 hours away, that the doctors weren't even sure anything was really wrong, that I'd gotten some scary news and blown it out of proportion. She told them all, in so many words, that the kindest thing they could do was not engage with my drama, because engaging would only encourage me. That's why nobody called. It wasn't that they didn't care. Some of them, I genuinely believe, would have cared if they'd known the truth. It's that the person they trusted to tell them the truth had decided that the truth was inconvenient. My grandmother thought she was being a good grandmother by giving me space. My aunt thought she was respecting my privacy. They had all been handed a story that let them off the hook, and they took it because that's what people do. People believe the version that requires the least of them. I finished my last infusion on a Thursday in October. There's a bell at my clinic, a little brass bell on the wall that patients ring when they complete treatment, and I'd watched other people ring it for months and cried for them. When it was my turn, there was nobody there to clap. My soup co-worker had to work that day. My neighbor was at a doctor's appointment of her own. So I rang the bell in an empty hallway, and the nurse, bless her, hugged me, and we both pretended that was enough. The wedding was 2 days later. I almost didn't go. God, I almost didn't go. God, I almost didn't go. But here's the thing about being raised to make yourself small. Even after everything, some buried, stupid part of me still wanted to show up, still wanted to be there, still thought that if I just appeared looking okay enough, smiling enough, taking up little enough space, maybe I could earn my way back into being family. So I went. I wore a wig that itched and a dress that hung off me because I'd lost 22 pounds. I put on more makeup than I've ever worn in my life to cover how gray my skin was. I drove myself again to a lakeside venue strung with $10,000 of Cathay lights, and I parked between a Range Rover and a Mercedes, and I walked in alone. Nobody recognized me at first. That's how much I'd changed. When my stepmother finally clocked me, her face did something I'll never forget. It flickered. For half a second, there was real shock, real fear, because she had not expected the proof of her lie to walk through the door looking like exactly what I was, which was a person who had survived something terrible without her. And then she recovered, and she smiled her event planner smile, and she came toward me with her arms out like we were the closest people in the world. And she hissed in my ear while she hugged me, "Whatever you're doing, don't. Not today." I didn't do anything. That's what I want you to know. I didn't go there to make a scene. I had decided somewhere on that long drive that I was going to be a ghost at my own funeral. I'd sit in the back. I'd eat nothing. I'd leave before the dancing. I would let them have their perfect day, and I would let them have their perfect day, and I would let it be the last day I ever gave them anything. It was my husband's who broke it open, and he had no idea he was doing it. He found me near the dessert table during the cocktail hour, this big, friendly, slightly overwhelmed guy who clearly still couldn't believe his luck at the woman he'd married. He stuck out his hand and introduced himself because, of course, we'd never actually met. My stepmother had made sure of that, and he said something like, "You must be the famous sister. I've heard so much." And I made some polite noise. And then he frowned, this genuine confused frown, and he said, "Hey, are you okay? You look really pale. Are you not feeling well?" And I was so tired. I was so tired of being managed. So I just told him the truth, quietly, no drama, the way you'd tell someone the truth. Quietly, no drama, the way you'd tell someone the time. I said, "I finished chemotherapy 2 days ago. Ovarian cancer. I'm okay. I just don't have a lot of energy." I watched his whole face change, because here's the thing nobody had counted on. He was a resident, a doctor, second year, oncology rotation, behind him. He knew exactly what those words meant, knew what a person 2 days off their last infusion looked like, knew it wasn't something you blew out of proportion, and he said slowly, "Wait, they told us you'd exaggerated some test results. My grandmother sent a card to your stepmother's address for you because nobody had your information. They said you didn't want visitors." I'd never gotten a card. We stood there for a second, both of us doing the same horrible math, and then he asked me, very gently, like a doctor, to show him. Not to prove anything to him, he believed me, but I think he needed to see it to believe the size of what had been done. So I rolled up my sleeve and showed him the port, still healing under my collarbone, the bruising in the crook of my elbow that hadn't faded, and I pulled up the patient portal on my phone, the timeline of every infusion, the lab results, the surgical report from when they'd removed the tumor in July. The July when, as far as my family knew, I'd been going through a phase. He went very still. And then he said the thing that, looking back, was the moment everything turned. He didn't say it cruelly. He said it like a man whose entire understanding of the family he'd just married into had rearranged itself in 90 seconds. He said, "My grandmother prayed for you at our rehearsal dinner. We all did. We held hands and prayed for your speedy recovery from your, quote, difficult time. Your stepmother led it. She cried. She performed grief for me to a room full of people while making sure none of them ever actually reached me. I didn't ask him to do anything. I want that on the record, too. I didn't say, expose her, ruin the wedding, blow it all up. I was too gutted. I just wanted to go home. But he asked me, would I mind if his grandmother came to say hello, the real grandmother, the one with the pearls, and I said no, I wouldn't mind because I genuinely had nothing left to lose. What happened over the next hour wasn't a screaming confrontation. It was quieter than that, and worse, the way the truth is always worse than a scene. The grandmother came over, this tiny, sharp-eyed woman, and she took both my hands in her papery ones, and she looked at my face, really looked, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Child, what have they done to you?" And I started crying right there by the Petit Fours, the first time I'd cried in front of any of them through the entire 8 months. People noticed. People always notice the crying woman. And one by one, the story came apart, not because I told it loudly, but because I finally told it at all to people who'd been fed a different version. My aunt overheard. Then a cousin. Then my grandmother, my actual grandmother, who had driven 4 hours because she wanted to see me and had been told by my stepmother that I probably wouldn't come. She's been so unstable lately. My grandmother, who I'd been quietly grieving the loss of for months. took one look at the port under my collarbone, and put her hand over her mouth and said, "But she told me you were being difficult. She told me you didn't want to hear from us." My stepmother tried. "I'll give her that." She came swooping in with the smile, with the "it's not the time," with the "let's not do this here." You know how she gets. But it doesn't work when the person you've been lying about is standing right there, bald under a wig, with the medical records open on her phone, surrounded by people who can finally see her. It just makes you look like exactly what you are. My father stood at the edge of it all and said nothing, just like the thumbs up, just like always. And I realized, watching him not defend me, not defend her, not do anything but exist uselessly at the perimeter of the worst thing his daughter had ever survived, that I'd spent my whole life waiting for a man who was never going to show up. The grief of that was almost peaceful, almost a relief. There's a strange freedom in finally stopping the wait. I left before the dancing like I planned, but I didn't leave as a ghost. My sister's new grandmother-in-law walked me to my car herself, slowly, with her hand tucked into my elbow, and at the door she pressed something into my palm and folded my fingers over it. It was a check, a big one. And I want to tell you what I did with it, because the comments on a story like this always go one of two ways, and I know which one people want. I gave it back. Not because I'm noble. I'm not. I could have used that money. Cancer is staggeringly expensive in this country, and I'd burned through most of my savings on what insurance wouldn't cover. On parking at the hospital, on the cold cap that didn't even work. But I gave it back because I understood, even then, that taking it would turn my survival into a transaction, would let them all feel that something had been settled, balanced, paid, and nothing had been paid. I told her, "Thank you, truly, but I don't need to be rescued. I already did the hard part by myself." And she looked at me for a long moment, and she nodded, and she said, "Then let an old woman do the easy part." And she made me promise to come to Sunday dinner at the lake, and somehow, against everything, I believe she meant it. My sister called me a week later, sobbing. I let it go to voicemail the first time. When I finally called back, she told me she hadn't known, that her mother had told her I was just being jealous, just being dramatic, just being me, and she believed it because believing it was easier than imagining her sister going through chemo alone while she picked out napkin rings, and I believe that she believed it. I do. But here's what I've learned, and it's the only wisdom I have to offer from any of this. There's a difference between being deceived and choosing not to look. The group chat was right there. My updates were right there. My updates were right there, gray and unanswered. She read every one. Being lied to about me didn't require her to ignore me. That part she did all on her own. I didn't scream at her. I just told her that. I don't talk to my stepmother anymore, and I don't talk to my father, and the strangest part is how little I miss the version of them I'd invented. I had a relationship with who I needed them to be, not with who they were, and you can't grieve a person who was never really there. What I have instead now is smaller and realer. I have a coworker who still texts me every Thursday, the day I rang the bell, just to say Happy Thursday. I have a neighbor who taught me to make her soup. I have a grandmother I drive 4 hours to see, who waited at the wrong end of a lie for months and forgave herself the moment she understood. And I have, improbably, a standing invitation to a lake house I once walked into alone and walked out of, held up by a stranger. It's been a year and a half. My scans are clean. My hair came back curlier than it was before, which everyone says is common, and which still feels like a small joke the universe decided to play. I have a port scar I can feel under my fingers when I'm nervous, and I touch it sometimes the way other people knock on wood. People ask me if I'm angry. They expect me to be angry, and there are days. But mostly what I feel is this clear, cold gratitude, the kind you can only earn the hard way, for finally knowing exactly who would hold the bucket, because that's the whole thing in the end. That's all family ever was supposed to mean. Not the name, not the blood, not the binder or the lake house or the pearls, just the simple, unglamorous question of who shows up at 4 in the morning when the numbers won't hold still. I know my answer now. I learned it the expensive way. And I will never again mistake the people who share my last name for the people who will share my fear. That's the title nobody told me I'd have to earn. Survivor. It's not a sad word. I used to think it was. Now I know it just means I'm still here. And I finally know who's here with me. The thumbs up my father sent was the smallest thing, and somehow it explained everything that came after. Cause and effect rarely announce themselves that plainly, but that little blue icon was the whole story in miniature. A man who would always choose the least effort a person could get away with, married to a woman who had built an entire life out of managing how things looked. Put those two together, hand them a daughter who'd been trained since childhood to make herself small, and of course, it ended the way it did. I was sick for 8 months and nobody came. That wasn't bad luck. That was the natural result of who they'd always been, finally meeting a moment big enough to expose it. What I've come to understand is that my stepmother's lie only worked because everyone wanted it to. She told my grandmother I was being difficult, and my grandmother believed it not because she was foolish, but because believing it was easier than driving 4 hours to find out. The lie traveled fast because it asked nothing of anyone. And here's the harder truth I had to sit with. My sister read every update I sent and answered none of them. Being deceived didn't require her to ignore me. That choice was hers alone. People will hand you a comfortable story, and most of them will take it, and the only protection against that is the willingness to actually look, to check the thing for yourself, instead of accepting the version that lets you off the hook. That's the part I'd want anyone watching to carry. Doing right by the people who are suffering isn't complicated, but it is inconvenient, and that inconvenience is exactly the test. It would have cost my sister 1 text. It would have cost my grandmother 1 phone call. The decency was never expensive. It was just unwelcome. The clear-eyed part matters too, because for years I confused loyalty with refusing to see. I kept texting that dead group chat out of hope, and hope is lovely. But hope that won't open its eyes is just a slow way of getting hurt. The day I stopped waiting for my father to become someone he was never going to be was the day I got my life back. Seeing people accurately, even when the accurate picture breaks your heart, is its own kind of freedom. And the strength, the thing I'm proudest of, wasn't the confrontation or the records on my phone. It was the quieter work. It was driving myself home to be sick into a grocery bag and getting up the next morning anyway. It was ringing that brass bell in an empty hallway and letting a stranger's hug be enough. You don't get to choose whether the hard thing arrives. You only get to choose whether you keep standing through it. I stood, alone mostly, until the right people found me. And when an old woman pressed a check into my hand, I gave it back, because surviving had already given me the only thing I needed, which was the certainty that I could. I learned who shows up at 4 in the morning. I learned it the expensive way. And I will never again confuse the people who share my last name with the people who will share my fear.